Hey, Cindy, it's Chris. I saw you join. Maybe not on the voice side yet. Hey, guys, this is Chris Williams. I'm one of the instructors for tonight, and we'll get started in just a few minutes.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Hey, Cindy, I just stepped away for a quick second. I don't know if you're trying to talk to me.
No, just wanted to let you know I'm here.
Okay, great. All right, Cindy, I show 6 o'clock my time. Think we should get started?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, I think I'm presenting the first section. So do you want to do introductions for yourself first and then hand off to me?
Sure, that'd be great. Thanks, Chris.
All right.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to tonight's session. We're glad to have you here this evening. This will be the first time you have Chris and myself, but we have a couple more sessions, I think, with you as well scheduled. So we look forward to being back with you for those. So tonight, of course, we're going to be going over lesson 2 in starting the project. Y'all have already covered three sections of this lesson. And so tonight we're going to be focusing on planning and managing budget resources. So we're really excited about that. Can you hear me okay, Chris? I just want to make sure I'm coming across clearly.
Yeah, you
Yeah, we
sound
can
great.
hear you, Courtney.
I can hear you.
Okay, great. At any time I fade out, please don't hesitate to pop in and let me know, okay? But anyway, I'm Cindy Horton, and I'm here this evening with Chris Williams. Chris and I have been partnering for the last couple of years on teaching the PMI prep courses. So again, we're really excited to be here. I am currently a lead product manager with the mid-markets organization under Jennifer Van Buskirk and Robert Boyanovsky. My team is responsible for focusing on our customer experience. So we engage in quite a number of projects and initiatives to help improve the customer experience for our mid-markets customers. That's where we're focused. But we also partner across the organization with mass markets because they handle a part of our business customers as well. As you know, our business customers can go into the stores. So we partner with them to try to stay in alignment on our customer experience initiatives, as well as with our large business or enterprise business customer experience as well. I've been with AT&T now for almost 22 years, coming up in November. I originally joined with our mobility or wireless organization, and I've had several roles. I've been in several towers basically in that organization, from IT to business customer care. I've been in senior leadership, supporting them as a chief of staff in the past. I've also been in talent development with our sales leadership and development program. And as well, I went on into business marketing, which in 2018 led me over to an opportunity with Xander and with Warner Media. And so I worked over there for about 4 years. And then this past December, came back over into AT&T to work on the small biz and mid-market customer experience initiative. I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in business administration. And Lord, if I didn't have enough of that, I went ahead and decided to start on a doctorate program. So I'm engaged in that right now and focusing on executive coaching, which is eventually where I hope to or aspire to go to in my post AT&T years. I also have certificates in quality, privacy, and cybersecurity, and as well as in project management. I earned my PMP in 2017. So I've already been through 1 cycle of recertification, working on my 2nd cycle right now. And then I kind of think the keys to success, of course, we like to share those with you guys. You probably have been hearing it from some of your other presenters as well. But I thought what was key to my success in getting passing the PMP on the first try was having a study partner. So if you don't have a study partner, somebody that can help hold you accountable, I surely encourage you to get that person. Y'all get a date down as to when you're going to do that exam, and push each other to get there, marking along. Basically, project manage this baby all the way to the end, right? I joined the Project Management Network Education Committee here in 2019, began working with Chris. I really do enjoy teaching because I think it helps solidify the concepts for ongoing practice as a project management practitioner. So, it's like they say, you can teach somebody, you learn it even more, right? And then it also helps others in the organization, like yourselves, right, to put, to achieve your professional goals and enjoy helping in that regard. And of course, I also think it makes our company stronger, really, to have people on the same page in terms of how to manage projects. We all know we may not use everything. Of course, we don't all work on, enterprise-wide projects, but still using, portions of what you learn in good project management principles and practices really makes for nice projects. And especially if you move on to go do something else, you're leaving back, something back behind about your projects that's easy for someone either to pick up on or to find information From a personal note, I work from home. I live in Albany, Kentucky. We moved out to the countryside about a year ago and have really been enjoying the beautiful scenery out here. We basically have lots of cows and hills. I'm married. I have 2 daughters, a son, and 5 grandchildren. And I also enjoy walking, biking, golf, dance, politics, cooking, wine, and if you're in Kentucky, I enjoy bourbon. So with that said, let me turn it over to Chris and let Chris introduce himself. We'll get started.
I enjoy bourbon. That's a new one. I haven't heard that one, but I know that about you. That's funny. I got to say, I don't have as much to say about myself as Cindy does. I'm not as accomplished as Cindy, but let me start. Let me share a little bit about myself. So I'm Chris, and I've been with AT&T for 16, going on 17 years. I spent the majority of my time with AT&T. I started off in sales and then moved over to service management quickly after that. And I had several different positions across service management. One of them was I managed a team of black belt or Six Sigma project managers. They were all black belts, and that was fun. But 2017 is I joined Global Project Management, and I've been a director in Global Project Management since then. And I already see, I took a look at our list. We have some of our students are from our organization, Global Project Management team. So welcome to everyone, but also to the team, people that are on my team as well. But nonetheless, let me back up. So when I started in 2017, I made it one of my goals to get my own PMP because when I came in, I noticed it was important. It was good. Everybody was doing it, and I wanted to reinforce it. So I did it. I took the class later that year when I first came in, and then I sat for the exam in February of 2018 and passed the first time. Cindy passed the first time. Everybody can pass the first time. You just got to apply yourself and do it right throughout this process. So we're going to give you little tips and tricks as we see fit. Cindy shared, hers was around get a study partner, study buddy. One of the things that I know is important that worked well for me was to find the right method of learning for yourself. And for me, it was more about the Rita Mulcahy book at the time and less so about the PMBOK guide. I'm not trying to downplay it. I found Rita Mulcahy a little more comprehensive, a little bit more interesting. It kept me awake a little bit better, which was the PMBOK guide was a good sleeping aid for me for whatever reason. But I did that, and I did a bunch of quizzes, the online quizzes all throughout the day. When I had 5 minutes between calls, I would just constantly quiz myself. And I did have a study partner at the end that really helped me nail down the information, get it into my head. I read the Rita Mulcahy book, I think, 3 times. And the first time obviously was much more in depth, took a lot longer. The second time was half the time, and then the third time was half the time of that. So kind of cut it down to a quarter. I took a lot of highlights, not so much notes out of the book, but highlights in the book. And I used that just to kind of fast track my my reading on the second and the third time. And to me, that was the best way to absorb the information. But I think even today we have, from the mentoring sessions, the groups, there's so many things, avenues that you can follow to really help you learn the information. So, but when we see things that we think are important, we'll call it out in there. But beside that, that's my work history and personal. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. I have married we just celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary. I was on vacation last week. We're off celebrating that. I have thank you for the little claps. I have 2 grown kids. I have a daughter who lives in New York City. She's a computer programmer, works for New York Times. I have a son he was a finance major, works for Regions Bank down in Atlanta. So kids are off the books. It's a good time to be alive. And I'm excited to be here. And like Cindy said, we've been doing this together for a couple of years, doing different classes all the time. So it kind of forces us to learn some of the new things in the PMBOK guide, not just get stuck on one. But we have done the plan and manage budget and resources before. So I do know that it's a good lesson. It's not an incredibly long lesson, which is that should get a lot of claps there too, because that's means we're not going to maybe go the full 2 hours, but it is good, and we'll kind of walk through it. So with that, Cindy, I'm going to share mine so I can kind of walk through the presentation, if that's okay.
That's
there you go. All right, let's see. All right, let me go back and share. 1 second. There we go. All right. Can you see and do I sound okay? I should ask that up front.
Yep, we can hear you, and project looks good too.
Super.
We can see you.
All right. All right. So let's jump into it. So plan and manage budget and resources is what we're talking about tonight. Topic D, they call it. But anyways, so here this is a basic statement. It makes sense, right? You got to have proper management of your project cost, because if you don't, that your expenses can get out of control very quickly. So think about that. It makes sense, right? You got to be prepared also to adjust and apply all of the costs, the correct costs, to the resources and to the activities and the services, all the different ones that align with your budget. And so we're going to be talking about budgets. We're going to talk about estimating tonight to get you some of that. And then the last piece on this one really is just the cost management plan. This is a plan we can produce, and you'll see it helps you plan, helps you react to situations. It helps you update project cost when issues or changes come throughout the life cycle of your project until you close it. So like most things that you're going to learn about in all of these different chapters, all the different project plans that are a subset of the overall project plan, you pretty much in the onset of a project, you think through every scenario, you plan every possible thing out. So when you're ready to roll forward with your project, you're not going to run across things that you haven't even thought of or you haven't planned for. And that's the benefit of a good project plan, is that it will set you up for success. All right. So let's jump into deliverables and tools. In the old days, they used to be called inputs and outputs, but deliverables are going to be outputs, things that you produce as a result of going through this process, the deliverables that come out of it. The tools are going to be the tools that we use to actually help us navigate through this step in the project management or the project plan development, if you will. So start off with this topic that we're talking about tonight. It addresses various what we call enablers from the exam content outline. They're the ECO, and you may already have a PDF version of the ECO that saved in your files. But tonight we're going to be talking about estimate budgetary needs, so estimation practices, anticipating future budget challenges, so looking at risks and challenges that are going to be coming up or potentially, monitoring budget variations and working with an existing governance process that you may have, and then planning and managing the resources that you need in order to carry out your project, complete your project. All right. So on the deliverables, the first three are just bolded. I want to call those out and let's talk about them. The first up is the cost baseline. Let's just define it. The cost baseline is the sum of all of the cost estimates for all of the tasks on your project schedule. So we've used the term baseline many times before, right? It gives us something to measure success or failure off as we move forward. And this is no different. A cost baseline is, again, it's the sum of all of our cost estimates, because we're in the front end of this project. We don't have actual cost, we have estimates. And you try to get as accurate in your estimates, and then you roll them all up, add them up, and that's your cost baseline. And again, that's what you're going to measure success off as you move forward in your project. All right, so that's number one. Number two is management reserve, or sometimes they call it MR. You may see it just like an acronym. It's the total amount of the allocated budget, or the total allocated budget, and the word for that, or the acronym, is TAB, and it's withheld for management control purposes. So it's basically discretionary to cover expenses that are unforeseen, and it's at the management's discretion. And this is rather than being designated for the accomplishment of a specific task, because if it's designated for a specific task at the onset of a project, then it would be part of the cost baseline. The management reserve is outside of the baseline, and again, it's for unforeseen expenses or changes, things that come up. Okay. And then the third one is the resource management plan. This is a component of the overall project management plan. So it's one of the smaller plans, and it provides you guidance on how to project resources, how not to project, but how the project resources should be categorized, allocated, managed, and then released when you're done with them, right? So it's all around the resources that you need to conduct a project. A resource could be a person, it could be, it could be contracted, it could be an in-house employee, it could be other things as well. All right, and then the things that that we're also going to talk really about are change request, cost forecast, risk analysis. Those are also deliverables that come out of this section. And then on the right, you'll see the tools that we have, and the tools are going to be estimating techniques. We're going to talk about 3-point analogous, parametric, t-shirt sizing, planning poker, just some of the variants, different ways to estimate cost. And then we're going to have review organization data. They're tools. So some of these things, they're not like tools that you would put into play. It don't make always perfect sense. But reviewing organization data is simply sitting down, and before you get into this, is you review the organizational data that you have at your fingertips to see if there's anything that you can glean from it that will help you guide through it, and maybe how the organization has planned for cost in the past, things that they use in particular, steps that you can follow. So meetings, for example, as a tool, it's really just utilizing meetings with people to share ideas and come up with new ideas as a result. There's nothing more than that. And then leverage the project management information system. It's a tool. If you're in a project organization like we are, we use ServiceNow as our PMIS. It stores all of our project related data, and it allows us to extract data, report on data, show updates on our projects, show project plans, when they're going to complete, all those kind of things. Then the next is understand change control. So again, as a tool, just make sure you understand what is the change control process that your project is following, so that when somebody does need to make a change or request a change, you're not caught off guard. You know what steps you need to take, and you're consistent throughout the project, so you protect the scope of your project, right? Or in this case, the cost of the project. Use velocity data and analysis. We'll talk a little bit about that. Throughput analysis, again, cost variance, earned value management. What is the EAC? Is estimated actual cost. Cindy, keep me honest here. Anyways, and then you have features accepted versus featured remaining. As you're going through a project and you're checking things off and completing it, you know what's been done and what's still in front of you to complete before you can close out a project. So these are tools on the right side, things that you'll do to help us get through this process. Okay. All right. Next up, let's talk about cost estimates. So estimate cost is a process of developing an approximation of the cost of the resources, the various resources that are needed to complete the project work. Seems pretty straightforward, right? The key benefit of this process of estimating the cost is that it determines the monetary resources, the money required for the project. This process is performed periodically throughout the project as needed. Let me pause this for a second. Some of the things you're going to hear me talk, and you're going to say, I don't see this on the screen. And that's by design. We have some notes that we follow. We tried to build it in. We tried to take the ones that we want. So, and that's okay. We don't have it all dictated anywhere, but just kind of follow along, and we'll pause for questions as we go through it. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more on cost estimates. So cost estimates include quantitative assessments of a probable cost that are required to complete project work. So makes sense, right? Numbers, quantitative, and as well as contingency amounts that account for identified risk. We talked about the management reserve, right, as one of the deliverables. That's something that is part of this as well, the contingency, and it covers the unplanned work that we didn't foresee up at the front. So these cost estimates can be presented in a summary form or in a detailed form. It depends on the project or the project manager or the organization. The costs also are estimated for all resources that they're applied to the cost estimate itself. So what are we saying there? We're basically saying that you can estimate cost at the beginning, at the onset of a project. You can do it throughout the project. It's going to be based off of quantitative assessments, which is data, facts that you have to work with. but you're also going to have to figure out from a contingency perspective, when things don't go off the rails, you have a management reserve to cover the unplanned work. All right. And then costs are estimated for all resources that are applied to the cost estimate. This includes, but it's not limited to, direct labor, materials, equipment, services, facilities, IT, information technology, special categories such as the cost of financing if you're going to be in a long-term project and you have to think about interest. Also, inflation, if it's a multi-year project that you have to account for inflation, like in today's world. Exchange rates, if you're buying and selling goods into different countries, you have to factor exchange rates and the variances and the strength of the dollar versus the different most of the world exchange rates or monetary systems. And also the cost of the contingency reserve. So if you're pulling money and holding it back, there's different costs. There's indirect costs and there's direct costs with that. So a lot of things have to be factored into estimating cost. And cost are for all resources. So it's not, like I said, it's just not people up there. And then also, last thing on this is logical estimates. Logical estimates, in other words, estimates that can be explained. You can explain it to somebody else. It provide a basis for making sound decisions about the projects, and they can establish the baselines against which you measure success of your project. So a logical estimate is basically, it can be explained. It's used for making sound decisions. It's nothing more than what it sounds like, is what I'm saying. All right, I'm going to pause here. Any questions?
I got salad products on the street.
Everybody hanging on. All right, got a little background
Hey,
noise, so I'm just
Chris,
going to
I'm
mute all.
so sorry. I did have
That's
one
okay.
question for you on this one. So when
Yeah.
we talk about the management reserve, right? Because I know we go through like the cost management plan and everything like that. When we go with the management reserves, how are those calculated? Is there like a particular formula with it? And when do we do that, or that process in the project?
Yeah, that's a good question. Is it a specific formula? I'm not really certain if, we're going to talk a little bit about ways to estimate. And one of the things is going to be using experience, and drawing back on previous projects. I don't know if there is a percentage of total cost estimated that you need to, it may be that you need to hold off as a management reserve. It's a good question. I wish I knew the answer to it, but I don't specifically. But I would imagine that I would say to me, the way to answer it would be, number one is go off of expert analysis, is find people that have either done a project like this before. What did they do? And then, but there very well may be some guidelines that says use a certain percentage of your total cost to hold back as management reserves. I could see that as well. I don't know, Cindy, do you know? Have you run across that before?
I have not. In fact, but I just read something earlier today on that. So as soon as I find it, I will shoot a chat off to you. But I saw something in the Mulcahy book about that today.
Okay. All right. Very
Yeah,
good.
just
Thank
put
you.
it in the chat as well. Usually it looks like it's
Okay.
like 5 to 10% of the cost baseline.
Boom. There you go. That makes sense. Okay. Thank you. All right. Now let's talk about techniques for estimating cost. And like you said, advantages and disadvantages. So the first one that I mentioned just a second ago was expert judgment, or just people have done this before. It's not shown on here, but it is a valid one. When you fall back on, what we call expert judgment, and you use it for like labor cost, material cost, inflation, risk factors. This, if you combine it with historical information, look back at some previous projects, this is going to give you good insight on all of the information related to your project and how you should proceed with it. The expertise that you get from other people that have done this before could be either an individual, it could be groups of people, and you'd want to look for people that have specialized knowledge or training that falls into your particular category. But if you do it, it can help you get to a pretty accurate cost baseline. It's a good way to start, and it's quick and easy. So again, that's one that's not shown on here, but should be mentioned there. So let's jump into the first one up is analogous estimating. So analogous estimating uses the cost from a previous project with a similar scope or activities to predict the cost of future activities. So basically you fall back on what's been done before to predict what's going to happen for you. So if you just an example, easy one. If you have a project that had $100,000 in estimated cost before, and your project is similar enough in the scope and the size, you could start off by saying, you share the same budget. You're just going to estimate that it's $100,000. So the advantage of the analogous estimating process is that you can ensure that there's no work that's inadvertently omitted from the estimates, meaning that you're basically leaning on somebody else's work in the past that has done this and has completed a project, and assume that they would have uncovered something if they missed it and put it into the notes, if you will, or we'll talk more about lessons learned, things like that to fill it out. So you can look back on that. But bottom line is that you're just riding off the back of somebody else that has done the project very similar before. So the advantage is you can pretty safely say that you've captured everything that needs to be captured. But on the other hand, sometimes it's difficult for less experienced managers, or they say lower level managers, to apportion the cost estimates out because they don't have the details. They haven't gone through it themselves, let's say. And since you're not falling back on a detailed plan to get you to that cost baseline, that you're just riding off of somebody else's back, that you don't have the detail to break it out and where you're going to put everything to. So that's the downside of this. So that's the first one. The second one you'll see is parametric estimating. So this relies on the statistical relationship that exists between historical information and the variables to arrive at an estimate for parameters such as duration and cost. Basically what this is that you break it down to estimating based on unit rates. So like if you're going to build a sidewalk, you know, and every sidewalk has little squares in it. I want to say little, but maybe like 3-foot squares. You can go down and find what would be the cost for each square. And then if you need 100 of those squares, you just multiply it times 100. So basically you take it down to a small unit, you get your understanding of the labor cost, the material cost, all of the costs that you have to build this project. And if the project is this one square and you say I need 100 of those, you just multiply it out times 100, and it gives you a pretty accurate understanding of what your costs are going to be for that, right? So the advantage to parametric estimating is that it's not time consuming, because you really just start off on a small scale and then you just multiply it. The disadvantage is that it may not be that accurate. Depending on the integrity of the historical information and the data that you have to work with, it may not be 100%. So that's the downside of that. And then the third type of estimating, or the third estimating technique, is the bottom-up estimating. So this is a method of estimating a component of work period to the cost of the individual work packages or activity, and you roll them up. So basically you start off at the lowest level and you look at every aspect, every work package that you have for your project, and you figure out what the cost is for each one of those. So you do a lot of the work on the front end, and then you roll it up. You just add them up. So the benefit, like it says there, is that it's more accurate and gives the lower level managers more responsibilities. They also know where the cost should be allocated and booked, if you will. The disadvantages is that it could be time consuming because it takes more work, and it can only be used after the WBS, or the work breakdown structure. If you've talked about that, is basically we take every function, every work action that you have to do in a project, and you break it to its lowest level, and you have to define what the scope of that WBS is. the activities, and so that somebody could pick up a WBS and have no clue about the project, and they can read all your data, all your supplemental information, and they have a complete understanding of what they need to do to complete a WBS or work breakdown. Okay. So again, the benefit is that it is the most accurate. The disadvantage is that it takes a lot of time, but you're doing all your work up front and you have a complete detailed plan of your cost structure and your breakdown for that cost. And then there's one other one that's not on here. It is the 3-point estimating, basically where you look at the cost in 3 different ways. One is most likely, so it's most likely to hit that level or to be accurate. And then you have an optimistic view of a cost. It could be a lower cost maybe in that case, right, where you're trying to save money. And then a pessimistic view. So there's 3. You have the O is the optimistic, the M is the most likely, and then the L is the pessimistic. And I'm not really sure why the L is pessimistic, but nonetheless. And you take those 3 and you calculate a mean and a standard deviation, and it gives you a point that you can work off of. And because there's 3 points of estimation, it does offer an accurate view of what your costs would be. So for these, for example, for the exam to study, what you want to have is an understanding of the definition of each and what's the advantage and disadvantage of each. You're going to find these in the PMBOK guide. You're going to find these in whatever supplemental book that you use, like Rita Mulcahy, and just have an understanding so that if somebody asks you what it is, that you'll be able to define it and the plus and the minuses for it. All right. Okay. All right, common estimate types. Let's talk about this. So the first one you'll see on there is the rough order of magnitude, or ROM, R-O-M is an acronym that you may see for this one. This is an estimate. It's a general estimate of a project's level of effort and cost. It's rough. It's a rough cost as it's defined, and it's generally made early in the project, and it's developed without the basis of detailed data. So you don't have a lot to work with. You're just kind of developing a rough cost estimate, and you use it on a high level of historical data. So looking back on other projects, it may not be the total cost baseline we're talking about. It could be just if you want to develop a cost estimate for a particular part, you look back and say, what did they spend on this? What did they spend on that? And you kind of do an average or however you want to do it. So you look at past data. It's a high level. It's not detailed. It's not granular. You pull in the expert judgment. You say, hey, you've done this before. What do you think? What would be a good estimate for cost on here? The problem is that the accuracy could be to -25. You could miss to the plus. It could be up, overage on +75. That's a wide margin. That's a wide range. So the accuracy is not that great, but it doesn't take a lot of time, and you can do it, at the front end of your project. It gives you something to get started with. So again, these are estimate types that we're talking about. So the second one on the left you'll see is definitive estimate. Just by its name, you can tell that the margin of error is going to be much tighter, smaller, between -5 to +10. It's also called a controlled estimate or a detailed estimate. You may see that listed. And the definitive estimate, it's the most exact type of estimate defined in the PMBOK guide. So if you read through, you'll see these, right? And it's based on detailed information about the project work that's in front of you. Because again, we're all planning here. And it's developed by estimating the cost for each work package in the WBS. So again, the WBS is the lowest point you could bring it down. You can't break it down any further. And there's work packages in the WBS that build into that. So you're developing, you're estimating the cost at each part of that WBS, and the accuracy is tighter. Okay. And then you have phased estimate. It's also called a rolling wave or a moving window. the way you think about this one for the exam especially is that the unique thing is that because it says phased, you're only estimating one phase at a time of a project. So instead of trying to estimate cost across the length of a project, you know, in these cases in the PMBOK world, projects could go multiple years. The benefit of this, you're only doing one phase at a time. So that helps you, it gives you, you know, a shorter window to work with. So it allows you to use, it's a use of a less detailed, like maybe a rough order of magnitude so that you could do some of the latter parts that you don't really have a vision for yet. You could do a ROM on the latter parts, and you could do this phased estimate for the first phases, where you have the work has to be done first. It's earlier in the project life cycle, and you know more about what the potential cost would be because it's right in front of you. It's not down the road. Okay.
So would this be more for like an agile, a project working in agile something?
You know, agile works in iterations, and that's similar to a phase, but in this part, we're not really talking about agile because you'll find
Okay.
that projects, you could have smaller projects that are phases of a larger project. And you may not
Okay.
even be rolling into a program yet. You could have project phases, and each one is a standalone project. But that's a good point. It's similar to that, but yeah, we're talking about standard waterfall projects here, particularly.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. All right, so we're switching gears. Let's shift over to project governance. So project governance as applied to cost estimates, because that's what we're still talking about, right? They can be described as managing project phases. And a different type of cost estimate and a level of accuracy may be required for different phases of the project, of each phase of a project life cycle. So again, project governance, managing phases, different type of cost estimate, different level of accuracy may be required. So it doesn't all have to be the same throughout the life of the project. So when you're choosing a cost estimating method of what to do, right? And it could be varied by phase, like we just said. So you can make your decision based off of something maybe like a software availability. If you know if you need, there's a certain software that's available, one that's not, that could drive your decision. You could also have team member experience. Again, a cost estimating method. If you have people on your team that have done something before that they'll vouch for it, or they can be experts on it, that you want to fall in line because you think you have a better chance of being accurate and just overall success. You could have a particular project lifecycle phase that you're in that would dictate to use one method for estimating cost over another. And then you also have time cycle constraints. Let's say if one estimating method is detailed and lengthy and you don't have time for that you might need to get something a little bit quicker. And then a project definition, maybe the project defines the method for estimating cost up front when it's handed to you. You might fall into that. And it could just be personal preference, right? Something that you've done in the past, the way that you think is one's better than the other, just from what you know. All right, so we're just really touching on governance. It's really around governance in scope of budget and cost estimates. You're gonna get into governance and projects more at a later time. We just wanted to touch it here. So from one fun thing to another, compliance. Let's talk about compliance. So you're gonna get compliance. It's gonna be covered in lesson 5. It's gonna go into more detail, but we're gonna touch it here because it's important to call out compliance, because in regarding estimating cost and creating the budget, that it's an important piece as well. So let's just right from the top, you'll see it says projects must be compliant with internal and external standards, such as appropriate government regulations, corporate policies, product and project quality, and project risk. It's all pretty straightforward. And then project compliance plan is a subplan of the project management plan. And in this step, you classify compliance categories. You determine potential threats to compliance. You analyze the consequences of non-compliance, and you determine necessary approach and action to address compliance needs. So the bottom line is this, is that regarding establishing the budget, you need to factor in the cost of compliance. It is a cost. These are budget items that are often underestimated. So think about the actual cost, but also the allocation and the cost of resources that are going to be needed to ensure compliance throughout your project. You got to factor those in. That's why we want to talk just briefly about compliance here. Okay. Lessons learned register. So one project document that may be consulted and of course updated as a result of carrying out the process of estimating your cost is this, the lessons learned register. And we want to do this because lessons learned from earlier in the project can be applied to later in the project. And you want to take advantage of the knowledge that you previously gleaned. Also, experiences that you gathered from previous projects, it's an important component of the budgeting process. And then lessons learned registers, they contain valuable information about cost estimating successes and shortcomings that can be used to develop cost estimates for activities and work packages and similar projects. So I don't know if anybody works with the lessons learned registers, but it's think of it as this in a broad sense. You're taking all the things that you learned when you did the project and you're writing them down and you're leaving it for people that come along in the future and do a similar project. So they don't have to stumble and make the same mistakes you do. You help to not shortcuts per se, but you give them the wisdom that you gathered, things that you learned. And again, like I said up at the first, it can be used for phases of a project or it could just be used later in the project. So you can benefit from your own lessons learned, especially if it's a long project. Right. So we'll talk more about lessons learned. You'll probably see that in each one of these different sections that you go through. All right, let's talk about guidelines for estimating cost. So accurately estimating project cost. If you do it right, it will avoid overruns and unforeseen expenditures. Because like we said, planning, if you do planning up front the right way, you're basically thinking of every possible situation that could arise. You're covering it from a cost perspective, you're covering it from a risk perspective, and what you need to do to react to things that are unforeseen. So also, we talked about the definition of a cost baseline. If you do a good job of estimating your costs, you're going to have a strong cost baseline. And again, that is used to measure the success of the project going forward. So let's talk about the guidelines for estimating cost. When possible, the cost figures that go into the cost estimate for these individual work packages, they should be provided by those who provide the resources. What we're saying is the people that are providing the resources should be able to provide the cost for those resources to you. They're the ones that know best what the cost will be, as opposed to everybody else. So the people who do the work, people that provide the service or supply the materials, they can give you the best estimate of what the associated costs are going to be. Sometimes you'll find that it is the project manager's responsibility to dig these out, but in minimum, it's the project manager's responsibility to compile the cost and turn them into realistic estimates. Okay. Next guideline is gather any relevant input information that may help you prepare the estimates, such as estimating publications and resource rates. Next is determine which estimating techniques to use. So you figure out what you want to do. Also look for alternative costing options, such as stock components versus custom-made components. Maybe stretching the duration of an activity to eliminate overtime charges. Maybe leasing something versus purchasing it. And then maybe outsourcing versus doing it in-house. Those are alternative costing options is what we're talking about here to help you save money long-term, but still meet all of the measurements of time, cost, quality, and whatnot for your project. The next guideline is determine the units of measure that are going to be used. It sounds pretty straightforward, but especially if you're, is it metric? You don't know if you're crossing into different countries. You got to define this stuff up front. Consider possible risks that may impact the cost. Again, this is all part of the planning phase. Ensure that all cost estimates are assigned to the appropriate account according to the chart of accounts so that you know where the costs are going to be allocated. And last but not least, make sure your cost estimates include estimated costs for all resources that will be charged to the project. Pretty much think through the project entirely, capture everything. The level of estimate, degree of certainty, try to, you'll talk about, assigning the level of certainty with it. And then last is a list of assumptions made when developing the estimates. You make note of those assumptions, and that helps you for document purposes. You have to fall back to figure out what were those assumptions. You have them written down. Okay. Next slide is guidelines for estimate budget. So just back up. We did estimate cost and estimate budget is what we're talking about. So it's very close, but a little different. So now that we've done the cost estimates, we can now do the budget estimate. So it kind of rolls up to a budget, right? So first up, we have aggregate or roll up the estimated cost of the individual work activities, the work packages to establish an authorized cost baseline. So again, you take all the individual costs, you roll them up, and you use that to develop your authorized cost baseline. Next is ensure the budget contains all of the funding needed to complete the project as defined in the scope baseline and the project schedule. And then the last is measure the project cost performance against the cost baseline as you move forward on the project. So we've nothing new there. We talked about each one of those, but it's just pulling it together on this one slide for estimate budget. All right, and that actually is where I'm going to transition and hand it over to Cindy to start picking it up from there. So while we're doing the transition, just use it to pause. Any questions on the slides that I've covered? Any of the content? All right. Very good. You can always ask questions later, or you can put them in the chat.
Mhm.
All right, Cindy, you there? You want to take over?
Yeah, I sure am. Hey, Chris, do you think we want to take a break, or do we want to keep going through?
What are we, 48 minutes in? I think about halfway. You want to do a 5-minute break? Let everybody just stretch your legs and then come back?
Yeah, I think that'd be great.
Okay. So I
Let's
got
do that.
48
5
after. Just want to say 55 after? So give us 7 minutes?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
7 minutes.
55 after. All right, thanks, guys.
Yep. All right, so it's 5 minutes till. We'll go ahead and continue on with the rest of the content for this evening. So we're going to pick back up with cost baselines. We're going to talk a little bit more about it. So a cost baseline is the approved version of the time-phased project budget, and it excludes any of the management reserves, which can only be changed through a formal change control procedures. And we'll talk more about the management reserves in a moment, as we've already discussed prior. And the cost baseline is used as a basis for comparison to actual results. The cost baseline is developed by adding the estimated cost of project components by period. The cost baseline typically includes a budget contingency to accommodate the risk of incurring identifiable but not normally occurring costs within the defined scope. Cost baselines will vary from project to project and depending on each project's unique budget and schedule. Once the cost baseline is established, it becomes a commitment from the project manager's perspective. The project manager should try to closely match the project's committed funds to the baseline from a timing perspective. We're going to talk more about that when we get to funding reconciliation. If it needs to be changed, the change must be done through the formal change control procedures. So estimating the cost baseline. The project manager can estimate a cost baseline following the guidelines summarized here to assist in the monitoring and measuring of cost performance throughout the life cycle of the project. First, you'll gather the inputs needed to establish the baseline, such as the work breakdown structure, or WBS, the project schedule, the cost estimates, and the risk management plan. You're going to use this project schedule to determine when work will take place. Next, you'll use one of the methods that we discussed earlier for assigning costs. You'll allocate funds for each work package for the time period in which it will take place. Then you'll consider adding that contingency reserve that we talked about to accommodate for the risk of incurring extra expenses. Remember to avoid adding contingency reserves for work packages with low risk values. Okay, so you really want to focus your contingency reserves toward those work packages that have the higher risk values. And then next, you'll total the cost for each time period, and then you're going to plot that cost for each period in a chart to create the S-curve, which you see here. And then lastly, you're going to publish and distribute the cost baseline to the appropriate project stakeholders. Okay. And this is just another view of it. I got this from the Rita book, and I thought it was very useful. So I wanted to go ahead and just share it here with you as well. So this is just another way to look at it. You probably won't have this in your slides because I did this slide myself. But activity cost estimates, we're just starting down at the bottom, right? Activity cost estimates are rolled up into the work package cost estimates. Then the work package costs are then rolled up into the control account costs, and finally to the project cost. This process is what we call cost aggregation. And after the risk assessment planning is done, the contingency reserves are then added to determine your cost baseline. These are shown at the project level as described here, but note it's also possible to add contingency reserves down at the activity level. And in our last step, our final step, the management reserves are then added. And since the cost estimates that make up the cost baseline are directly tied to the scheduled activities, this enables a time-phased view of the cost baseline, which again is typically displayed in that form of the S-curve as we saw on the prior slide. You know, for projects that are using earned value management or EVM to monitor the schedule and cost, the cost baseline is referred to as the performance measurement baseline. So that's just another word that we'll use as synonymous with cost baseline is performance measurement baseline when we're talking about EVM. Okay. Management reserves are added to the cost baseline to produce then what is the project budget. As changes warranting the use of management reserves arise, the change control process is then used to obtain approval to move the applicable management reserves into the baseline. Okay, so just to remember, a key thing to remember here is that management reserves are not part of the cost baseline until an actual change request has been submitted to make that so. Okay. let's talk a little bit about budget challenges. Ideally a budget's set during project planning and it doesn't change. That would be ideal, right? However, most projects don't exist in a perfect world, and one or several things can happen to pose a challenge to the project manager, such as a new or changed project requirements. These are often based on data collected by the organization regarding how the organization intends to use the project deliverables. New risks or changes to the probabilities or impacts of existing risks. This is why it's really important, to make risk assessment something that happens throughout the project, not just at one point during the project. And then changes to cost estimates that result from economic factors or procurement contract modifications, resource costs, etc. So budget challenges are always going to arise. It's something you have to plan for and know how you're going to handle them. So how do we respond to the budget challenges? When one of these things occur, one or more of the following things are going to have to change. Either the project budget, the project cost, the project schedule, or the scope. And some might even argue the project quality, But if the budget remains fixed and additional funds are not available, then the project must simply change in some form or fashion. However, there's a thing called agile budgeting, you may have heard of it, or lean-based funding. These types of methods, they offer flexibility to projects prone to change, right? Agile budgeting happens in shorter intervals, quarters, for example, instead of years. And then lean, which is about just-in-time delivery, enables you to allocate budgeted funds just in time for the use. And I mentioned funding limit reconciliation earlier, so let's talk a little bit about that. Funding limit reconciliation, the definition of it, is the process of comparing your planned expenditures of the project funds against any of the limits on the commitment of funds for the project to identify any variance between the funding limits and those planned expenditures. So let's kind of dig into that a little bit more. Okay, most budgets, as you know, are created on the premise of the steady incoming and outgoing flows. Large sporadic expenditures are usually incompatible with organizational operations. So, for example, if equipment costing $500,000 is scheduled to be purchased on June 1st, and the money for the purchase isn't going to be available until July 1, then the activities that are dependent on that equipment will have to be moved to later points in the schedule. So the cost baseline, therefore, is considered time phase, as we talked again, giving us that S-curve that we saw earlier. Funding limits are often in place to regulate the outgoing capital flow and to protect against overspending. And I don't know how many of you are kind of get butted up against our budget planning at AT&T, but we work in this thing, right? We get to the end of the year, rolling into the third, fourth quarter, things begin to change with how the capital budgeting is managed, right? So we all have to make some adjustments in our projects. So the project budget must be reconciled with any cost constraints in the charter. If the project estimate exceeds the constraints, the project manager must meet with management, explain why their cost requirements can't be met, and then propose options to decrease costs. Pay particular attention to what I just said there. The project manager needs to be prepared to propose options to decrease costs. So as with the schedule, project managers have a professional responsibility to reconcile the budget in this way. The schedule, in turn, can affect the distribution or the acquisition of your resources. So for another example, customers set funding limits for large projects based on internal considerations, such as when their fiscal years begin and end and how healthy their cash flows are. A customer who wants to spread the cost of a project over 2 quarters might authorize $250,000 in spending during quarter 1 and then $350,000 during quarter 2. So in response, the project manager would need to align the resources, schedules, and the activities so that the project work doesn't exceed those limits or that funding. Okay? So that's funding reconciliation. So while you can't plan for all eventualities, there are a few guidelines to help you plan for future budget challenges, right? So number one, you want to keep that stakeholder register current. and be aware of changes to project requirements. If new stakeholders are added to the project, see what they, have in mind. You'll want to monitor risk frequently. We mentioned that a few minutes ago, and look for new risks and changes to existing ones, right? Monitor the performance of your suppliers and your vendors, because that can be pretty fluid as well, depending on the dynamics of the economic environment. And then monitor all changes to the project, and follow the change management system to try to keep them within the budget. Okay, just a few guidelines for anticipating those challenges. Okay. And then I think we're getting pretty close to the end. Yep. Yeah, this is a short section here. So, and then lastly, just recapping with the guidelines when determining a budget. So these guidelines include first, conducting reviews of the cost in your resource management plans, your scope baseline, the risk register, and the organizational process assets. For example, when you review the cost management plan, you're going to be looking there for information on how project costs will be managed and controlled, and the method used and the level of accuracy for estimating your activity costs. You're going to review your resource management plan for staffing attributes, personnel rates, and the reward and recognition information. You'll be looking at your scope baseline for the project scope statement, the work breakdown structure, and the WBS dictionary. And you'll also be looking at your risk register to consider what risks that might impact your cost estimation. And then also you'll be reviewing your enterprise environmental factors, or your EEFs, and your organizational process assets, or what we call OPAs, that can influence this process, right? So, such as cost estimating policies. Different companies will have different methods that they want you to follow for estimating costs. Cost estimating templates, looking at historical information, and of course the lessons learned, as Chris called out earlier. Next, you're going to check the project schedule for type, quantity, and your duration of resources needed for your project activities. You're going to use tools and techniques such as cost aggregation, reserve analysis, expert judgment, historical information, and funding limit reconciliation, as we spoke of, to determine a budget for your project. You'll document the project budget, and then you're going to create that cost baseline. Understand project funding requirements. This includes ensuring that project expenses are not incurred any faster than the project income is received, right? And then when the determined budget process is complete, the cost baseline, including all your funding requirements, is established. Naturally, many of the inputs of the process will be updated, such as the cost estimates, the risk register, and your project schedule. Cost estimates are updated to record any additional information, and the project schedule may need to be updated, as estimated costs for each activity may be recorded as part of the project schedule. And then the risk register may need to be updated as new risks are identified during this process, and of course managed using your risk management processes. Okay. So yeah, very quick on the ending here. That kind of concludes this part of it. So we covered tonight the following enablers, just to recap that. We estimating our budgetary needs, anticipating what our future budget challenges might be, monitoring our budget variations and working within the governance process, and then planning and managing those resources. Okay. So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.
Hey, Cindy, I did have a question for you. So when we talk about the risk register, I've kind of, compiled this into two questions. The first part is the risk register is getting updated throughout the entire project, correct? And also when we talk about the risk register, that's being used as a resource by the project manager to kind of go back, assess the risks, and look at the risks that have been identified, right? And determine the mitigation for that, correct?
Correct. And then of course any contingencies, right? So, when you're trying to, you may know that some, let's say your input, some type of input, materials or supplies or whatever, that there's some volatility around the pricing, right? You kind of expect it's going to come in at a certain price, based off your historical information or some estimates. But you also know that there's some things going on, maybe in the economy or the world, right? Like we've been experiencing with oil, right, and the cost of fuel, that you may need to set aside a contingency, right? So you've identified this risk that, in your risk planning phase, right? And now you want to go back and look at that as you're putting your cost estimates together to determine what your budget's going to be. And yes, you are correct. Your risk register is something that you're keeping updated, throughout your project.
Thank
Does
you,
that answer
Cindy.
the question? Oh, good. Great question. Thank you. Other questions? Budgeting is very exciting, isn't it?
Hey Cindy, this is Erin. I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around estimating costs, estimating budget. And I think I'm stuck because in my past fields, you're presented with this is what I have for a budget, as opposed to right? A project
Yeah.
manager saying this is what your budget's going to be. You're actually told this is my budget, and you have to work within that constraint. So can you really dumb down the difference between estimating costs versus estimating budget for me?
Yes. So the way I look at it is for estimating costs is associated with the tasks that have to be done, right? And the work package at the work package level. So on the screen, I pulled back up that, view that, again, you don't have it in your deck, but you can see it here on the screen. Your work packages are starting down here at your estimate. Say, activity 1 is you've got to, do some type of coding or whatever, right? These are your activities. And so you start, this is of course the bottoms up type of estimation process, right? And then that builds up into your work package estimates. Then it goes into your control accounts, and then that becomes your project estimates. And you may have multiple project estimates, right? Remember, you're thinking in terms of like PMI wants you to think of is in big projects, right? Multifaceted, huge projects, right? So there's projects within that particular project that you're doing, right? And then you estimate your contingency reserves, which then gets into the estimate of your budget. I estimate that my budget is going to be this based off my costs. Does that make sense?
And correct me if I'm wrong, Cindy, that also is like sometimes, like for instance, like the 3 control account might not sometimes be included, right? And you would just kind of use like 1 and 2 as say up to work packages and then the estimates, right? And the contingency reserves are only for when you're doing the baseline, but the management reserves are only, inputted when you do the total cost budget for the project, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. Christy, you want to add anything to what I said?
No. You covered it well. Thank you. Yeah. And Aaron, I get it that there's many things in this that you have to slow down and just think to wrap your head around. Like you said, it's tough sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're right. At AT&T, we're usually going to get our budget sent to us, right? And like I can tell you now, I've got a project I'm waiting to get funding on, and it's funny. It's very arbitrary. We haven't even really done the estimation yet, but we're asking for $5 million because we don't think we're going to get any more than that. But we need to get started. It's just crazy, But you work within what your constraints are in your particular company or your particular area of projects. But typically speaking, you're working on very huge projects. There's a process of determining what those work packages are based off the activities, right? And working bottoms up to come to your budget, your desired budget. And then, of course, if the funding piece of it doesn't align, then you've got to make changes, as we discussed earlier, right? The project's got to change in some form or fashion, the scope or whatever, because the actual budget doesn't align with your costs.
I just have to personally keep in mind that we will be providing the budget as well as the.
Yeah,
or at least
the
determining the
yeah.
budget, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
You're in control of everything as a project manager.
I
Indeed.
I know. That would be wonderful if I could tell everybody this is what it's going to be, rather than the other way around.
You're in control and responsible for everything. That's a better way to say
Okay.
it.
There you go. What other questions? All right. Well, we'll certainly be monitoring the chat after we finish here shortly to see if there's any other questions you might have. Happy to help in any way that we can. Before we get ready to dismiss, though, and give you some time back so you can go study. Let me come back. I'm going the wrong way. Let me go back here. There's one other slide I added on here. So I always like to share a resource. I don't know if y'all have gotten to earned value management yet, or when you're going to get the EVM. If you haven't gotten to it yet, I can't remember where it falls. But if you haven't gotten there yet, you certainly need to study it and get very good at it. And this is a resource that I used, how to get every earned value question right on the PMP exam. It's got like 50 plus exam questions in there. It's a very good little book. I didn't have a bit of problem with doing EVM questions on the test, felt very comfortable with them. And then also the other book I have over there, which is also by Eileen Ellis, is network diagramming. I don't know when y'all do that either. I'm sorry, I don't have a good picture in my mind of how everything flows and all the courses and stuff that you'll be taking. But if you haven't gotten to network diagramming yet, you will. And that little aid right there is a very good aid as well. And you can get them both on Amazon. Okay.
Now that you bring that up, thank you. I did have a question.
Thank you.
For anybody.
You're welcome.
The TCPI, do you think that will show up on the exam?
Say that one more time.
Do you think TCPI, so work remaining divided by funds remaining? So I had a question because I was studying that yesterday, and I'm just wondering, I know we've discussed that we are not going to be doing any math on the exam. We have to understand the formulas, but I don't believe we'll be doing any of the math. I wanted to make sure of that because I did come across a question in my studying where I had to divide 2,300,000 by 2,800,000. And I thought, oh my God, if I don't have a calculator, I'm dead.
Well, I remember having to do math. I guess maybe they've changed the exam now, so it's great.
But
if
it
you don't have to do.
wasn't, I don't remember any complicated division like she just described without a calculator. Yeah, I don't remember
Yeah.
thinking, I can't, I know how to do it. I just can't do it because it's too big of an equation. Yeah, I don't remember that ever popping up on at least my version of the exam.
Yeah, because I know that we have to understand. We won't have to actually do the math, but I have seen some practice exam questions where, they do throw out some of the answers. There are numbers in there, which basically tells me I think we have to do some math in head. So that kind of frightened me, especially since one of my practice questions yesterday was.
I tell you, Erin, probably one of the best things to do is kind of touch base with one of the mentors. I'll too reach out to see if I can find out kind of on the the new format of the exam. It changed the year after I took it. I mean, I remember having to do some kind of calculations, right, to be able to come up with the answer, but it may not be the case anymore. I would say it's still probably a good idea to know how to do it, but at the same time, again, if they say there's no math on there and you just need to be familiar with the concept, then that's wonderful. And I think some of these exam questions that you may be coming across are probably, holdovers from the past when there were some calculations that needed to be done.
Quite possibly and hopefully.
Yes, I agree. I agree. All right. Any other questions, comments? All right. Well, this gives you about 40 minutes back. I hope you, might enjoy it in some form or fashion or use it towards your studying, and wish you all the best. Of course, we'll be back with you for a couple more sessions, I believe, coming up, but we'll look forward to seeing you then, and just continue to be here for you if you need anything.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks, Cindy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You
You're
bet.
Thank you.
welcome. It's been a pleasure. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.